be just as educational and riveting as day one. Just a few housekeeping matters. Please remember to mute your device until you speak. Additionally, please note that questions should be submitted via the YouTube chat. Now, just a quick recap of yesterday's proceedings, which began with an opening session featuring remarks from the conference organizers, the principals of our respective schools, and the keynote address by Minister of Education, the Honorable Kay McConney, who shared the government's vision for the ideal person that the education system should produce. And that was a global citizen with Bajan roots and a Caribbean consciousness. The minister also actively engaged with our student presenters from Harrison College, Sydney Ford, Zenovia Storm Husbands, Giovanni Gittins, Emmanuel Seeley, and Jordan Gregg. And from Queen's College, Kayla Smith, Keon Sobers, Alexia Daniels, and Christina Wharton. Our student presenters made the case for the inclusion of financial literacy in the school curriculum and explored the connection between society, the economy, and education. Meanwhile, our featured speakers for yesterday were Doctors Janice Fenoulier and Cardinal Ward, and our panelists were Donna Every and Curtis Gittins, who brought their expert perspectives on key aspects of education, including youth participation in reform, STEM education, entrepreneurship, and robotics. It was an enriching discussion indeed, and the recording of the proceedings is available on YouTube, and we invite you to revisit it as well as share with your networks. Today, we'll continue the theme, the future of education in Barbados, with the help of international educators, and we'll also hear from Barbadian professionals working in the gig economy. I'm quite looking forward to today's sessions. So we're going to begin with panelists from Sweden and South Africa. First up is Dr. John Rowe. Born in Cape
Good afternoon. My name's John Crowe, and I'm speaking to you from Cape Town in South Africa. I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about my educational experiences, particularly in Asia. I would like to look at three aspects of educational provision from my perspective. One, philosophical and institutional parameters. Two, teacher education, and three, classroom practice. Philosophical and institutional parameters. Within every country, there are institutions that reflect that country's value systems, either explicitly or implicitly. Education and schooling are no different. I have observed within my experience that successive cohorts of young people entering formal institutions of learning become subjected to a number of processes. These include regular academic assessments that rank and screen rather than nurture and creatively enhance learning. Failure then becomes embedded, and intellect becomes associated with school success. This has to be questioned. Number two, behavioral expectations that narrowly define good behavior as being quiet and attentive. Three, the adherence to curricula that makes more demands from memorization and rather less from intellectual endeavor. Once students have been processed by the system, they are then rooted to outcomes that include the world of work, higher education, or indeed unemployment. Or should I say, unfortunately, unemployment. If the educational philosophy of a given country is to ensure the equity of educational provision its delivery, and the attainment of optimal outcomes, then in my experience this has largely not been achieved. Let's move on now to teacher education. It's a very important aspect of education, or teaching and learning indeed. Teacher education. Let's accept that teachers have attained qualified teacher status. Then the importance of in-house measures to ensure good practice needs to be sustained. The system we adopted in China, which to me seems to be quite interesting, involved the following. The head of school would discuss the modalities of what was expected from each and every teacher in the school at the beginning of the school year. These included good lesson planning and preparation, and the importance of student engagement and involvement. Each teacher was observed by their head of department once per term, teaching a planned lesson. The teacher had to prepare the lesson and present it in written form to the HOD prior to the start of that lesson. After the lesson, the teacher and the HOD would then discuss the lesson, and the teacher would then have every opportunity to evaluate him or herself, whilst the HOD, on the other hand, would assess the lesson using given criteria. These assessments then formed a record of that teacher's progress and ultimately were used as promotion criteria. HODs in turn also had to be assessed, but this was done by the principal. And finally, the principal was certainly not immune from assessment, and this was done generally by directors of education. HOD meetings that were held fortnightly, and this is important, and recorded, were extensively used to promote good classroom practice. Importantly, these meetings were also used to ensure that teachers worked collaboratively in setting not only classroom tasks, but also tests and examinations. So the finer detail of test setting and certain classroom tasks were covered. This system worked greatly to the benefit of both the teachers and the students. Ultimately, a feedback mechanism involving students and their inputs would have been valuable or even ideal, but unfortunately, this did not happen on my watch. Let's move on now to classroom practice. My mantra has always been to teach individuals rather than class groups. I chose in my teaching to ensure that I discuss the progress of every student at least twice per term in a formal setting. Ideally, this should happen after the first few weeks of term and at the end of term after examination results. Perhaps this sounds onerous, but I found that time could be made for every student, and I found that they were also enormously appreciative of this initiative. Additionally, I was an advocate of collaborative learning. One example comes to mind, and this was the conception I had of a journey that had to be completed over a geographical landscape by a group of people who were stranded. This was posed to the class, discussed, and the class was then divided into groups, and each group was tasked to collaboratively set out their agendas in order to accomplish that task, and they were asked to do the following, or to involve themselves by doing the following: to discuss, to plan, to prepare, to keep diaries, to discuss survival skills, to discuss geographic skills, and to discuss and implement journalistic skills. Out of the 5-hour-long lessons I had with these students per week, we devoted 2 hours to what we termed the journey. My experience showed that the students became totally involved in this project, and all aspects, as stated above, of skill development were covered. Finally, in general terms, my Asian experience, i.e. in Malaysia, China, and Singapore, demonstrated the importance that policymakers gave to educational provision. Of note was the extent to which all the schools, in my experience, were extremely well resourced. Facilities included sports stadia and fields, comprehensive libraries. One example in Singapore was Raffles School, where the library was of university standard. Provision for clubs and societies, and of course, textbooks and classroom resources. Finally, on the administrative side, and I am here particularly referring to Singapore, it seemed that it was highly centralized, with little room to stray from not only a set curricula by the teachers themselves, but even heads of school could be replaced at a moment's notice to take up positions in the Central Ministry of Education. This was also generally the case in China, but certainly not in Malaysia. In Malaysia, heads seemed to have more autonomy. You might, from the Western standpoint, think that principal autonomy is important because certainly the principals seem to set the tone of any given educational institution where they find themselves. Anyway, that's what I have to say at the moment, and thanks very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.